All right. Thank you so much, rock star. You know, when David sent me the first email, or I think it was maybe a PM on Facebook or something like that, and I can't remember if he gave me the topic or not right off the bat, but you know, I looked at it and I thought about it, and I think I waited a day or two, and then my head exploded because I just thought context, you know, it's my wheelhouse, it's my, it's everything. But I did, with it, but you have to have some context to understand why that's true. They're huge turning points in my life have depended on context. And I didn't even understand what it was maybe at even some of those points. It's only looking back I understand that it wasn't an epiphany moment, it wasn't a coincidence moment, you know, it was really a stacking up of moments and experiences that led to a change in my life, and really, really big changes. Maybe not anything anyone would notice from the outside, because you have to have, you know, the context of it to understand why it was such a big deal. You know, sometimes we call it experience, sometimes we call it perspective. I call it context. I think that's that larger category that checks those boxes of experience and perspective, knowledge, education, whatever that education, you know, however that's manifest. And the more I thought about it, the more I kept thinking back to that movie that a lot of people say is their favorite movie of the year, you know, of the season and that kind of thing, and it's Love Actually, because the more I thought about it, I thought that, like love, context actually is everywhere. It's sort of like, almost like the Matrix to me. I know that sounds crazy, and I make a lot of movie references because I'm a big movie buff. I think that the first time I understood context, when I look back at it now, was it's a form of maturity, it's a form of maturing and respecting it. And oh, I was so stupid. I was a junior high kid, and I lived in a housing development, just an ordinary, very ordinary housing development. And believe me, it was ordinary. My best friends were heiresses, so I knew I lived in an extremely ordinary place, nothing special about it. But I didn't know it at the time. And I thought that the next housing development down was the ordinary. And I remember I was with a group of kids and made some, not derogatory comment, but some dismissive comment about this next housing developed down. And suddenly a kid stood up and said, well, I happen to live in one of those houses, and I really resent what you've just said. And that's when I'm 12 years old. And it absolutely stunned me. I was humiliated, I was ashamed, I was mortified at my lack of context, at my lack of experience, but I didn't know it then. I just knew I felt so badly. And wanted to spend kind of almost the rest of my life trying to figure out why I had the audacity to make assumptions about something you know, which I knew nothing, not just little, but nothing about. And that very much fit in to what I was doing in my life's path. I had the sad misfortune of deciding what I wanted to do when I was in the 3rd grade. And you know, there could be a lot of trauma associated with that if you're not just a failure, but if you never achieve it at all. You know, even enough to say you were a failure. I decided I wanted to be a journalist when I was in the 3rd grade. That's crazy. And I kept doing it. I started a little newspaper in my neighborhood, and I would use stamps and put stamp pictures on it, and then I'd make stuff up. Not really. Actually, the problem was I wouldn't make stuff up. My parents insisted I had, but I actually hadn't. It would get around. I'd put it in people's mailboxes, and I would talk about so-and-so's parents having a fight last week, and the next door neighbor burning the chili and having to dig out all the burnt parts at the bottom and sift it out of the chili before she could serve it at the potluck, and about the lady down the street, because this was very unusual, who wasn't married and had kids, and blah, blah, blah. And of course, they had to shut that baby down right away. But what I was lacking as a journalist back then was not only a camera, but context. Didn't know it. The day my world fell apart, I was a senior in high school. I was getting ready to, I'd sent out all my applications for college. Back then, you could actually be spring term in high school and not know, you know, where you were going at. I was going to, my boyfriend was driving me to a meeting for a week-long seminar on government I was going to in Washington, D.C. that I chose to do and actually paid for with my own money because that's what I wanted to do on my spring break. That's how big of a nerd I was. And we were on our way to this meeting. He hit my brother's dog and broke its leg off with his car. The dog was chasing the car. Context. Dog was chasing the car, broke its leg off, picked the dog up, take it to the vet. We get to the vet there says there's no way we can save this dog. It would be ridiculous amounts of money to save this dog's leg or this dog. And so we had to have the dog put to sleep. I had to come home from that to tell my brother that my boyfriend, well, and I was in the car with him, had hit the dog. I missed the meeting, which was a mandatory meeting, and I went to the mailbox eagerly awaiting my admission letter to Michigan State University, which I decided I wanted to go to when I was 12 years old. I know, this is all way too soon to decide things like this without context. And I got the rejection letter. And they rejected it because ACT or SAT, I can't remember which we were doing back then, had not sent my scores to Michigan State. And I was never really great in school. I was always sort of a 3.0 kind of a person, but when it came to anything literature or word related, you know, I was kind of off the Richter scale, and I think I scored like in the 99.999% thing, and I got a scholarship all the way through college awarded to me because of that, which was so weird because everything else, you know, wasn't so great. But Michigan State rejected me, and my world fell apart. I mean, I absolutely collapsed. I didn't know. And then, you know, the wheels were set in motion, and we got the scores sent to Michigan State, and everybody gave me an A my spring terms, so I would get in, and I got into Michigan State. But for years, I thought everybody must know I was rejected at first. And it affected me so profoundly, I felt unworthy to be there. And it started a pattern in my life of that, and I raise your hand if you've ever felt this, that imposter syndrome, right? Imposter syndrome is such a horrible thing to feel. You're moving along at the same pace as everyone else, but you never feel worthy. You feel like what you are is a really good fake. And it's a horrible feeling. And it lasted for many years. But I started to, I didn't have a name for it. I thought I was the only one who felt that way. Everybody else got it, but it was me who felt that way. And then I was in my second year of college, still feeling unworthy, still feeling like there must be a little notation they put on your record so that all your professors know that you were a reject at first. And that kind of thing. And then I met this guy, and I dated him for a little while, so we had some deep talks, and he finally admitted to me that he was a legacy, that the only reason why he was at Michigan State was because his parents had donated a ton of money to build a building, and because he was an ace tennis star all the way through high school, and he got in on a tennis scholarship, and that he was miserable. And he started crying and telling me how miserable he was, how he didn't want to be in college, how he wasn't good at it, he didn't care what he was studying, and he was crying. And he said, I'm so jealous that you knew what you wanted to do since the 3rd grade, and that look at you, you're happy and you love college. And I just went, oh my God. You know, I finally had some, not only, you know, I had some perspective, but I had some context about him. I thought he had it all. And he was miserable. You know, partly you could look at that behavior as sort of narcissistic. That feeling like everybody else has an answer but me. But that just feeds into the the whole I'm a fake thing even more. So there's all kinds of ways your mind keeps twisting it around and around and around again until you always get back to that same conclusion that, that you're a fake. But his struggle started to put my feelings into perspective. It started to create some larger context in my life, life context. And I look back at that moment a lot, and I think about it a lot. And I wonder about him, and I wonder how he's doing. And I wish I had that, I wish I knew. I don't like to lose the memory of those moments. I sometimes like to time travel, especially as a journalist. I like to time travel, and I don't know if anyone ever does this, but to remember the day when. And I always remember the day. I guess I remember the day I got my first article published, but what I remember more than that is the day that I went to submit the article to the state news. Now this was in the olden days. There were no computers. In fact, we still had just manual typewriters. That means no power to the typewriter back then. We did have some power typewriters, some electric typewriters, but you had to fight for those. But anyways, this was before I was anything. I mean, I wasn't on staff or anything, and I had written this horrible article, looking back, but I save it. It's the first one in my little folder that I keep of, you know, back when you used to go to an interview and you'd give them your portfolio. Well, you guys don't remember it probably, but there was a day. And I remember walking up to the steps of the Student Services building, literally like this, you know, just shaking, and then having to walk up the steps to the 4th floor where the state news was, Michigan State University newspaper. It was the #1 newspaper in the country that year, partly because it was the biggest, I think it was there 56,000 students, and this was back in by then, I was a 6-year student. I transferred a few times. Gosh, what year was that? I guess 1980. And I was just literally shaking. I could barely make it up. I could barely talk. I was breaking out in cold sweats. Walked in, and I went up to the freelance editor's desk, and I, you know, handed her the sheet of paper, because it was a piece of paper. And her name was Lisa Dahl. You never forget your first editor. And she said, she read it, and she goes, okay, be in the paper on Wednesday. And I went, okay. And I just kind of walked out. And then I remember running around the campus on Wednesday, picking up all the discarded newspapers, you know, just, oh, you know, well, how could they do, you know, what a mistake. You know, they must, don't they know? And I like to go back and remember that, because it reminds me every time I'm interviewing an intern, it creates a context for me every time I interview them. I can't know their actual personal experience, but I can put myself in their place, how nervous they are, how stressed out they are. I really want good interns because I really need my interns. We're a nonprofit and I'm understaffed and it's not funny. You know, when I tell you, Tom Ashbrook on point, well, nobody has any idea how hard that guy works and how stressful it is. Well, hello, he's got 8 producers, I have 2. He needs some context, big time, that's for sure. I like to remember that though. I like to remember what it felt like to feel powerless, be powerless, depending totally on the whim of someone who, they're not thinking, this is another kid, this was another student. Lisa Dahl, I got to know her, you know, I think she went into PR. I liked her a lot. She was a good editor. But she was just another me out there. I had a hang up for a long time at Michigan State at the time. This is so stupid now you look back and you can't believe this was a rule. But at the time, if you wanted to get credit for an internship at Michigan State, you couldn't take money for the internship. You had to pay the credit hours for the credit, but you were not allowed to earn money. And you couldn't get an internship in journalism unless you were willing to work full time. And I was one of those people that worked all the way through college and usually worked about 30 hours a week plus went full time. I simply couldn't afford it. It was not even in the realm. Only the rich kids could do internships. And I was really hung up on that. So by the time I graduated from Michigan State, even though I had a degree and a lot of other qualifications that I'll tell you about, I didn't think I could cut the mustard. Of course, I had the other fortunate experience of graduating during the first big recession in the newspaper industry. The first big contraction was in 1982. It was a huge recession around the country, and newspapers were hit very, very hard. So I thought, well, I literally did not even apply for a job at a newspaper because I didn't think I was worthy enough. That was sort of stage 2 of the imposter syndrome. The imposter syndrome was so intense, I lacked so much perspective on everything that I actually didn't think, I actually almost stopped my career. In fact, I did for about 2.5 years. And I did a lot of different things, and I did a lot of different things. One of the things I did for 1.5 years was travel around the country to 38 states, 57,000 miles, installing bathtub liners in hotels. Seriously. My parents were flipping out. You know, I had just gone through 6 years technically, of college, but I just got a bachelor's in journalism from a school of journalism, Michigan State University, and I was going to go install bathtub liners, wear a tool belt, a 40-pound tool belt with a Makita drill in it, and I just traveled all over the country. I put everything I had in storage, and I went with my boyfriend, and we were partners in this, and we worked for a company out of Tempe, Arizona, and we would go and we would install these, I can tell you all the details, God, I can't believe I can't remember what they're, acrylic bathtub liners. Now you see them, and you see them at home shows and stuff like that, but at the time it was very novel. There were a lot of hotels and motels that were getting outdated, and they needed new bathtubs, but they're super expensive to replace, so you just pop these bathtub liners over it, and my partner would do all the cutting, you know, because he was a man and he used the saw. I did the prep work on the tub, and I prepared it and used acetone every single day. I did have a mask on, a good chemical mask, and acetone, and then I'd put this black tape down, and we'd pop the tub in, and I can't remember how much we earned a tub, but we earned a per tub thing plus a per diem, and I walked away after 1.5 years with, I don't know, like $6,000 or $7,000 in the bank. It was the most money I'd ever had in my life, but there were 2 reasons why I walked away. The first reason was, I remember I was somewhere in Virginia, and I was sitting in a tub one morning, and all of a sudden I just spontaneously started to sob. I realized that I just dropped everything, and I had not pursued my dream because I thought I couldn't. I thought I wasn't worthy of it, and I thought, how do you ever pick it up from there, from a bathtub liner job, and go back into journalism? And the second reason was, so I knew I had to get out. I mean, when you're sobbing in a tub, and somewhere in Virginia, and I think it was Charlottesville, that's just not a good sign. This does not bode well. And then my best friend got AIDS. I promised him, he had called me that October, I was in Sedona. I was all over the country, all the way. I went to the World's Fair in New Orleans. It sucked, but it was a World's Fair, you know. When's the last time you've been to one of those? And I skied on both sides of the United States. I sailed on both sides of the United States. I hiked the Rockies. I did a whole bunch of stuff. I hiked the Appalachian Trail, all kinds of stuff, and great experiences. I met all kinds of amazing people along the line. But when I was in Sedona working on a tub, I get a call. I got my partner, my boyfriend, came in and said, "You got a phone call?" And I'm like, "Oh, I'm just in the middle of this tape, God." And you know, back then it wasn't like you had cell phones. You had to, like, you know, go down to the office, and then they'd tell you what room to go to, and you'd go to the room. And I said, I'm like, "Hello," and it's like, "It's Rick," and he says, "Hi, happy birthday." He tracked me down. That was in the olden days. You had to call the company had to figure out where you were, and then he took the time to call me. I was like, "Oh my God," and we talked for a couple hours, and it was fabulous. I loved him. He was my best friend in the whole wide world for many reasons, not the least of which was the fact that he took the time to call me on my birthday when I was in Sedona, Arizona, and it was a total hassle to figure out where I was. And I said, "All right, I'm gonna call you on your birthday." in November. And he said, no, just come and visit me for a couple days when you come back home in December. He lived in Lansing. And I said, all right, I'll do that. He said, just promise me you'll spend a couple days with me. He had been sick, under the weather. We didn't know what was wrong. It was 1984. And so I said, fine. And I was planning on spending a couple days with him. And we got to my boyfriend's parents' house in Pontiac, Michigan. And we went in the door, and I went right to the phone. And literally, I never took my coat off. I called Rick, and his mother answered the phone, and she said, oh, thank God, we've been looking all over for you. Rick has AIDS. He's just had brain surgery, and he's got about 6 months to live. And I went, oh, bummer. So I called the office back in Tempe, and I said, I'm giving you a month's notice, I'm quitting. And because back then, of course, no one would bring your food into your room. You know, no one did anything for you. It was a death sentence. And most people just spent the whole time in a horrible hospital where they didn't take care of you. In this case, it was the University of Michigan. And they were horrible. But, you know, everybody was back then. And you couldn't tell people who you were waiting for or what was wrong with your friend when you were sitting in the waiting room, because then no one would want to sit near you in the waiting room because they thought you could transfer it. This was back when people thought you couldn't use toilets, you know, and Rick didn't want me to use his toilet, but I was very rebellious. I thought, I'm not walking down the street every time I have to go to the bathroom. But, so I went through that. Well, all right, so I did this weird thing. I went and did installed bathtub liners, and I thought my life was over professionally. My best friend is dying. There couldn't be anything worse. But all that time, I was gathering string, the string of life. There was never any lost moments. There was never 1 second during that entire time where I lost a thing. Because what it gave me was clarity. The context of life gave me clarity. It made me realize that, yes, that is what I want to do, and that I do have to try to do it, or I'll never forgive myself. I'll never be able to sit in a bathtub again without crying. And then I remember when I was taking care of Rick, at one point, he said, you got to go get a job. You know, you need to make money. And I'd had all this money saved. It was so, we were talking about coincidences earlier. There is never another point in my life where I would have been able to take care of Rick like I did. And he was independently wealthy. Money wasn't the problem. It was really just having somebody with him. That wasn't, you couldn't buy that back then. And, you know, and then just someone who would go out and buy his favorite meals at his favorite restaurants and, you know, didn't care, didn't want to follow the rules, and, you know, I'd give him peanut butter and Ritz crackers, which was his favorite thing in the whole wide world, and even though the doctor said no. You know, I never would have had enough money to do that if I hadn't gone and done that 1.5 year thing that I did with the bathtub liners. It would have been absolutely categorically impossible. And I did. I had the money, and I was able to buy a car. This was a long time ago, and get, you know, and support myself, and I would spend, you know, live with friends in East Lansing, because that's where I kind of grew up at Michigan State. I thought, this is just so amazing that I was able to do that, and but I couldn't have done it, and I don't think I would have been able to do it or appreciated it if I hadn't have worked for it in that way, in sort of this kind of bass-ackwards way, a lot of people would say. I didn't even appreciate what I had achieved, though, afterwards. When I did start to go out and look for jobs, per Rick's suggestion, I would go to the smallest newspapers on the planet. I'm not kidding, these dots on the planet, because that's where I thought I had to be. Well, I couldn't get a job at any of them. And finally, I started calling them back and saying, and I wouldn't even get callbacks. I wouldn't even get anything. I started, like, can I just ask you why you won't even give me an interview? And they said, you're overqualified. You wouldn't stay a week at this paper. We're not gonna, you know, yours was way off the Richter scale. And I thought, oh, well, how so? And they said, well, you worked at Michigan State University's newspaper. You have to apply to get on that newspaper. It's not a, it wasn't a, what do you call it, a lab paper like it is at Ohio State, no offense. Ohio State's got a great newspaper, but it wasn't a lab paper. You had to apply to be on it. I was an editor, I was intern editor, and I edited the Welcome Week issue, which means, I don't know if they do that at OSU or not, where they have this big edition at the beginning of the school year. I would literally bring home grocery bags of copy with me. This was literally where cut and paste happened, people. There is a real cut and paste thing where you actually take a scissors and you cut it out, and then you use glue, rubber cement, right? Cut and paste. We couldn't afford tape. And I'd go home and I'd do that, and they said, yeah, you're overqualified. And then I applied for a job as a copywriter for a radio station, ironically. And he said, yeah, you are so, no. He goes, what are you doing? He goes, why aren't you interviewing and why aren't you applying at newspapers? I said, well, I tried, but they said I was overqualified. And they're like, yeah. You know, I had to have a lot of people tell me that. And then I applied to the Toledo Blade, blah, blah, blah. The rest is history. They sent me eventually to the Columbus Bureau, where I covered state government and politics. I remember when the publisher offered me the job, and the first thing you ever get that feeling where someone suggests something to you and all of a sudden you go, yes. It feels so right, and there's no logical explanation for it, but it just feels like home. And I went, yeah. I go, wait a minute, I don't even know who the Secretary of State is. He said, the fact that you even know you don't know that he says, that you even know there is a Secretary of State you have no idea how, that's really good. And he goes, you can learn what their name is. It's gonna change every 4 to 8 years anyways. And I said, all right, you know, so then I thought about it, and then I moved down here, and then the imposter syndrome set in again. Am I good on time? Okay. Imposter syndrome set in again because I was around all these people and I had no context. I didn't understand where they came from or who they were and how they got there. And I thought they must all be really good and that I'm the fake at the State House. Back then, it was a big State House press corps. There were a lot of women on it, not compared percentage-wise to the number today, but there were a lot more people. The Akron Beacon-Journal had 5 reporters. The Cleveland Plain Dealer had 6 or 7 reporters. I was doubling the size of the Toledo Blade staff, making it 2 reporters. Dayton Daily News had 2 reporters and an intern. Now, most of those places don't have any reporters. Akron Beacon-Journal shut down its bureau about, I don't know, like 7 or 8 years ago. It's a disaster. It's a horrible situation, but I didn't think I was, should be there and should be among them, and that was a very, very disabling, once again, a very disabling experience. Every morning I woke up in a panic, and I just internalized it all. I didn't tell anybody about it for years. But one day I went out to dinner with an old friend of mine who is a fancy lawyer in Toledo. He's on the Sentencing Commission in Columbus, and we were lucky enough to get together for an evening, and he started talking about about the imposter syndrome, and that was the first time anybody had introduced that concept to me, and I went, you mean it's a thing? You mean other people feel this way? And he said, yeah, I do, every single day. And this is a super fancy lawyer. I mean, he's not just fancy looking, I mean, he's a super successful, intelligent, brilliant guy. And then one day I wrote an article, I profiled Ken Blackwell, who was the Secretary of State at the time, and he was, as they put in the headline, the man who would be governor. He was considered a real possibility for governor, and I wrote a profile on him, and I sent it up to Toledo Blade. By now we have computers, and I don't have to walk it up a flight of stairs anymore. And I sent it to the editor, and he said that I couldn't have written it. And he actually called my partner in the bureau and asked him if he had edited it. And Joe Hallett was his name, and he was political editor at the Dispatch for many years too. We're very good friends still. And he said, no, I haven't even looked at it. And I found out about that, and I realized that I must be better than I think. And I slowly started to turn the boat around, and the true test occurred. when I left the State House after about 10 years. I wanted to settle here with my husband and our young son, and the only foot I could get in the door at the Dispatch was as a state desk reporter covering Appalachia, which sounded good, kinda, I guess, you know, but after you're at the State House for 10 years interviewing big shots and meeting people like, you know, just super fancy people all over the country, you know, all right, I'll do it. And I did it, and I remember hitting the road that first day and driving down to Appalachia, and I'm listening to a press conference with Governor Taft, and I just went, whoa, what am I doing? Where am I? I was in the bathtub again. And thinking I'd made a horrible mistake and that this couldn't work out and this couldn't be a good thing. And then, you know, and then I kind of dried up and got my act together and was driving down, and I looked around and I realized, no, I'm actually driving down into Appalachia. It's October 15th, and it's the most beautiful day of the year. And the alternative would be sitting in an office, maybe the Levesque Tower where my office was at the time, maybe the State House press room, maybe in some stupid press conference where some idiotic, you know, candidate or public official is trying to tell us what we're supposed to know and what they're going to do for us. And I realized, no, I'm on my way to Appalachia. And here's the kicker. Everything I learned at the State House made me a great reporter in Appalachia because I had an incredible context. You know, when I started out, I was covering the Sparta Village Council in a suburb north of Grand Rapids, Michigan. I didn't even know what a drain tile was. Now I knew about the laws that required what dimension the drain tile had to be to meet code, and why the city code mattered when it came to state funding, and why some towns were in so much trouble financially because they couldn't fit all the square blocks into the round holes. And I understood that, and I brought more depth to my reporting than anybody ever did. It was often considered a starter job. I made it a finisher job because I had context. I made it important. I brought something to Appalachia that nobody had in years, if ever. I knew what the Appalachia Regional Commission was. I understood what wheels were in motion working for Appalachia and working against Appalachia, and I could plug that kind of stuff in. I had context. So I just want to say, don't confuse first impressions with context. It's not the same thing. It takes work, and it takes time, and it takes experience, and sometimes it takes years to appreciate what you have. But every single thing in life for me has created the context now that I have for what I do in my job, and every single day I start out fresh, asking somebody, how does this feel? Where do we know this? Why do we know this? How do we know this? And every day it's fresh and new for me because it's just constantly building on that web of context. So thank you so much. I really appreciate your attention, and hopefully it's created a little bit of more context for you when you listen to me on the radio. Thank you.